Everyone, thank you for joining us tonight at our October programming event, all about the horror genre. I'm very excited. I mean, hopefully you'll give me a cozy horror novel to read for this season. So, or maybe not. Well, we'll see what happens. Lightning round. Of course, I'm just prepping them early so they can think about it. 'Cause I hate when I'm on the spot and someone says, "What's the book you want?" I'm like, so anyway, focus, please. The New York Book Forum is a nonprofit and tax-exempt organization dedicated to building bridges between the entire book publishing community and the public. We do this by hosting events such as author events, like this one, and providing educational forums for members of the industry. Our membership is comprised of fellow book industry volunteers and extends to all who embrace and celebrate reading. So authors, readers, anyone who likes the color, we want you here. Any creatives, that's what I really meant. Whether you're, sorry, I am reading from the spiel. Whether you are a creator, a consumer, a producer, or supplier, we recognize that the industry is nuanced and vast, which is why our mission is to build bridges between these various circles of the book world. Thank you again for attending tonight. I'm very excited for our program and am honored to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Gunnels, sorry. Jennifer Gunnels is an editor with Tor Publishing Group. And she edits and acquires science fiction, fantasy, horror for Tor, Tor.com, and Nightfare imprints. Oh, there's a lot of.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Okay, before coming to Tor, she served as dramatic critic and theater editor for the Hugo-nominated New York Review of Science Fiction, and has contributing editor for performance for the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction Online. I love that thing. It's great. It's where I go whenever I'm like, what? I need to know what this is. Okay, she has edited a special edition on performance for the Journal of Fantastic and the Arts and contributed articles on fandom to the online Journal of Transformative Works and Culture. Oh, that's good. Also good. I wasn't supposed to do this, so excuse my excitement. She co-edited Greek Theater, a collection of science fiction and fantasy plays with Aaron Underwood. Thank you, Jennifer, for leading us on this our discussion tonight.
Yay. So buckle up, we're going to go on a spooky odyssey. I have the honor this evening of introducing our two guests. First, we have Andy Marino. I'm going to read off of this. Andy Marino is the author of the horror novels The Seven Visitations of Sidney Burgess, It Rides a Pale Horse, and The Swarm. I don't like squicking me out. I don't like bugs. He also writes historical fiction for young readers. Andy was born in upstate New York, spent half his life in New York City, and now lives in the Hudson Valley with his wife and two dogs. I'm going to ask you about the dogs, like, you know this.
Yeah, that's cool.
Anne Heltzel is a New York-based novelist and book editor. In addition to writing horror, she has penned several milder titles for children and young adults. Just Like Mother is her adult horror debut. And they are also married to one another.
It's true.
And we're going to get to that too. So to start things off, one of the things that I always like finding out as an editor about authors is what inspired you. I mean, genre is a very niche sort of thing to do. And so I'd like to know about what inspired you to begin writing horror. Like, was it a book that kind of inspired you in childhood or young adulthood? And what is it about the core of the horror genre that really inspires you and makes you want to write?
Okay, sure, I'll start. For me, it was when I made the pivot into writing horror. I'd always been a horror fan, and like a lot of kids who were into reading, especially when I was growing up, like in the late 80s and early 90s, when I'm 43, so it was like, that was kind of the sweet spot of like, oh, I could read Stephen King books. I'm like a precocious reader, and you're all proud of yourself, right? So I was like, you know, I'd get like the uncut version of The Stand that's like 1,500 pages, and it's like a 12-year-old kid like be plowing through it with like weird illustrations and stuff. So that was always kind of percolating, is that like that was like Stephen King's big doorstop cocaine era. So it was like I was really into that, the books anyway. And so that was always in my head. And then when I became a writer and I was working on a lot of different stuff, kind of trying to find my voice and everything, I had when I was still in the city, a bunch of friends and I got really into like the Italian horror directors from the 70s, like Bava and Argento and Fulci, and we would just like mainline those movies, and they're all really surreal. Plot kind of is secondary to just like the atmosphere, so it taught me all these like terrible lessons about how to be a commercial horror writer, but I thought I could really bring something to horror writing because of that. I think that really informed the way I started working anyway.
I wasn't allowed to read any of those books as a child. I grew up in a very strict Catholic household, which probably explains in part why I now write horror. But aside from that, I started writing YA and kid content, and then I just found myself going darker and darker and trying to have to kind of squeeze it into these sort of YA parameters. And that's when I realized like I should, at the time I had a children's agent and I was a little bit nervous about making the jump to adult horror. But it just started to feel like impossible to keep trying to force it for YA, where you have to be cognizant of developing brains and things like that. So once I let myself go, that's when I really started to have a lot of fun. And that's what I like about horror, is there are no real rules. There are no parameters. You can do whatever you want. It's to me the most fun sandbox to play in. So. And I read a lot of, as an older person, read a lot of horror, a lot of like Gothic, Shirley Jackson, that sort of thing.
I'm late to the horror. No, it doesn't sound
Sounds really loud.
Well, you can always back off of it and project.
Okay,
That's okay too. Yeah, I'm kind of a horror newbie. I can thank my colleague Kristen to bringing me to the fold. I mean, I was always kind of horror adjacent, being a goth girl when I was growing up, but like I'd look at that and my imagination was like a little too much. I'm going to address the elephant in the room again, editorially. So you two are married, you're both writing in horror. And so I'm curious as to whether or not you read for each other, like do secondary reads, or if you influence one another with your work. I mean, like, does your work inform Anne's work and vice versa? Do you play off of each other? Have you ever written anything together? Or is that like divorce material?
We've never written anything together. I think we'd like to, but actually, this kind of harkens back to the way we got together.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell the story?
Yeah, sure.
Meet cute.
I had an agent who didn't do adult horror, and so I needed to make the pivot and get a new agent for the first time, which is a scary jump and everything. And I'd written a horror manuscript, which turned out to be The 7 Visitations of Sidney Burgess, my first horror novel. But when that was still in the manuscript stage, I remember that Anne, who I knew, was like, did some freelance editing. And so I reached out.
Met on a YA panel at the New York Public Library like 5 or 6 years before this.
Yeah.
Point.
So I reached out and I was like, look, I'm going to go out for a new agent, and I'd really like a second pair of eyes on this. I'm kind of a loner, I don't have like a writer's group or anything. Would you mind? Would you take a look? I'll pay you, obviously, you're a freelance editor and everything. And she was like, oh my God, I just did the same thing. Like I also pivoted and just got a new agent for my horror novel. So we were on this weird parallel career trajectory that we didn't even know about. And then her notes, she read it over like a weekend, and her notes were so good and just absolutely instrumental in what the book turned into eventually selling. And so that sort of started our,
Well, really, he was like, I have to take you out for drinks to thank you. And I was like, you already paid me. It's fine. And I said, I'm finishing my book, but maybe in a couple months. And he reached back out and I was like, all right. So that kicked that off. But we were on submission at the same time, which was really nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good lesson in kind of like removing your ego from the process and things like that, and learning to kind of like just coexist with someone doing the same thing in a field where there's a lot of like, gnarly competitiveness and stuff. So,
but we still read each other's work. I think I'm probably too, like, Andy started telling me to like not basically like mess with his.
Well, Anne's an editor. I don't know if you guys know this. Anne's an editor at Abrams, so her editorial skills are like legit, and she actually gives me editorial feedback, which
But
I
not
love.
like the most encouraging feedback all the time.
Yeah. And I am sort of like the contrary version, this mirror world version where I'm too nice. So like my feedback to her is useless because I'm just like, don't change a thing. But I will say that lately I also write middle grade historical series for Scholastic, and the deadlines are like this. So if I were to be like having her read everything, it would just be like outrageous. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't get to collaborate on as much anymore. But
I haven't read the last couple middle grade books, but I did read his new book is out next month, The Swarm, and it's amazing. My favorite of any of them so far. But that was one where like throughout the process, he'd start to mention something, and I had to really say to myself, no, just don't. Because I'd be like 10 points of view. No one.
Yeah, early on, I was like, I want to have 11 POVs.
Like 300,000 words. Your editor will kill you.
It's half that.
Please don't.
Yeah, but only after I told you to cut it.
Anne told me she was right about that.
So coming back to, I'm sure there are some people in the audience who are aspiring in some way to write things, or, you know, exploring whether or not they want to do that. Do you think that it's instrumental having someone else there to read, and having another person looking at your stuff? How has that helped you to hone your skill as an author?
Well, I think it's really important just on a basic kind of human level to learn how to take feedback, especially if you want to be a writer, but you just want to write whatever you wrote the first time and you don't want anybody to tell you like this chapter could use some work or anything like that, then you're never going to be a writer. Like that's just fundamentally, it's not just you in a room, it's a collaborative process. There's editors, there's agents, there are people who are going to give you notes along the way. And if you can't sort of like remove whatever part of you is telling you that you're awesome from that process, it's just never going to work, because you're going to become this stubborn person who, you know, can't take criticism, and that's really not what it's about. So
interesting, because I never have a part of me that thinks I'm so awesome. Every part of me is like, you're the worst. Like you need to rewrite this 8,000 times. So it is nice to have Andy giving me kind feedback. But I like pretty harsh feedback also, because it is, I mean, you know, you want to make something better. I have a separate writing group, as like Andy aside, but Andy's process has influenced me a lot because he really takes the care with each line, and almost has these like romantic ideas of writing that sometimes I'm a little cynical about, like because I'm an editor. But and it's a hard job. It's just a hard industry, as you all know. But anyway, like being able to take some of that and incorporate it into my work and really enjoy the process of writing and put a little more of myself into you know, the technique and the style of it, versus thinking, is this going to sell? Like, is this commercial enough? Was the pacing, like all those things, which are important, but it's nice to remember why we're doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think just as a quick kind of corollary to all that, it's a wire walk, right? It's like, you have to be stubborn and confident enough to believe in hopefully a vision and a voice, because that's what's going to get you noticed. But you have to be able to dial that back when people tell you, you know, if there's a consensus about like, maybe this character shouldn't even exist in this novel or something like that. Like, and that can be really difficult, but it's important.
All right, I'm going to loop back to some of the influences that you had in Italian horror cinema. And my next question is, I mean, the last time we really had a giant golden era of horror was really 70s and into like the mid 80s. So we are obviously having a resurgence. And why do you think we are having a resurgence now, out of all the times that we could be having a resurgence? And I'm looking at this other person. And do you think that the focus and the scope of horror as a genre has changed from what it was in like the 70s and 80s?
I mean, that's a really big question, but I think in the 70s and 80s, like you found it in Hollywood too, there was like sudden freedom. There were like all these auteurs, there were people doing whatever they wanted. And I think that bled into everything, including horror. And I don't know if some of that got subsumed in like the late 80s and 90s into like this really commercial kind of juggernaut system. And then there's the reaction against that when like a company like A24 starts and, you know, isn't going to make blockbusters and things like that. And then novels kind of follow suit or vice versa. And they kind of, there's a whole ecosystem out there of books and movies influencing each other and starting trends and things like that. I don't know. And I also think that there was, if you like the 90s, kind of when I came of age watching horror movies, like Scream was a big thing. And so there was like this big meta reaction against like a lot of the stuff that had come before in the 70s and 80s slashers. And then that kind of became stale and people started over again with like earnestness. And I think that's maybe this period we're still in, like until somebody starts making like A24 parody movies. But yeah, I guess I've talked mostly about movies. Books is a little harder for me to pin down, I think, because I'm not really a publishing trends person. I don't really know.
No, I want you to do projections for us right now.
Okay, yeah. I could do P&Ls and put up a spreadsheet if you
Like, what's the percentage increase on the sales?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have it off the top of my head, but
I think oops. There we go. That's interesting though, because I think typically, or at least my perception of it has been that movies have followed books for a long time, but with Jordan Peele and Get Out, I think it gave permission to publishers to experiment more. And now that publishers are, they've jumped on the bandwagon and realized how massively popular this sort of very thoughtful horror can be, and horror that reflects our current situation can be. Publishers have started to give more opportunities to writers in that space that just didn't exist before. So I think movies, like in this specific genre, movies did really lead the charge.
Is there a particular flavor of horror now that you think is like more prevalent? And by flavor, I mean like, our haunted house is really hot, is, possessed children, or just like, chainsaw massacring people kind of thing. Like, do you see some trends now versus then that, tropes that are more popular in the books?
it seems to me, and again, this is just an educated guess, but it seems to me that haunted houses are not as popular. Like haunted houses they were like a big thing for a long time, and then it feels a little played out now, but who knows? But yeah, horror's funny because like there are perennially popular things and there can always be new kind of twists on them. Like horror is such a free floating thing. Like, is it atmosphere? Is it plot? Is it the way the plot mechanics work out? Is it like a scary thing happens to the protagonist at the end? Like it can be all those things. So there's always going to be new twists on these old tropes, I guess.
I think the big thing that I've noticed, at least, is just a hunger for horror that's rooted in our current experience, like in the news and like big events in the world, like horror that feels really timely and topical, which it still like has to rely on sort of a perennially popular story. The story still has to hold up in itself, but it does seem like people are really interested in seeing and reading things that reflect their own experience.
What's something that you guys would like to see? Like if you had a wish list of like, oh, if I could write this horror book, or oh, if I could see this and read it, like no matter how complete, I have my own thoughts. They're pretty out there and wacky, but like, what do you guys think would make a cool new twist on a trope?
Ooh, that's a good question. I can only talk about personal preference, I think, in terms of that, but
that's okay.
I like big sprawling, I don't want to say failures, but I like things that kind of shoot for the moon. That's why I wanted to write a book with like 11 POVs, right?
Yeah.
So
please don't ever do that.
And I know that this is like a publishing nightmare, but I would like a return to that kind of like, there are a few authors like, here's the Dan Simmons doorstop, here's the Carrion Comfort, here's like the Stand. Like I would like a few authors who were like throwing that Swan Song, Robert McCammon, something like that. Like those things that kind of seem like relics of the 80s and 90s. I would like to see that, and I hope to contribute to that too a little bit.
When paper was cheaper.
Yes. Yeah.
What about you?
Honestly, I don't have a good answer for that one. I'd probably write it if I knew. I mean, I'm writing something I like, but I don't think that's like.
See, I have this mental image of like, how you have Etsy and how you have the web, but the web has the dark web. What if there were a thing like dark Etsy?
There you go.
Love it. Like, I would love to see dark Etsy. So somebody get on that for me, please.
There is a book by Grady Hendrix called Horror Store. That's like an IKEA thing. So that's kind
That's
of
the
like
kind of thing where
Yeah.
like any word in IKEA could easily summon something from like 4 dimensions over.
yeah.
I do love that like mashup of something very, I don't know, it's like I'm reading American Rapture, which is a Nightfire book right now, but May Fly, you kind of use that, such a good book, but it used that like Disney princess serial killer, like the mashup of one like very innocent thing and one really spooky thing. And I love that.
Yeah, I love stuff like that too. What is it that you think, what's making readers flock to it now, do you think? Because for a while it was very dormant and it had to kind of go under the guise of dark fantasy just to like not scare the adults, I guess. I don't know. But now people are kind of flocking to horror and we almost see a renaissance. What do you think it is about horror that's pulling people into it at this moment in the zeitgeist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is just pop culture in general, like what's become acceptable and things like that. Like the stigma around like being a weirdo and reading horror has certainly gone away, you know, like on the heels of like comic books becoming less of a niche thing and like the thing that rules everything. And also, but I guess the sort of flip side of that is also a company like A24 making it like pumping out these like psychological horror films that are awesome and that pretty much everyone can agree are great in their own way. And I think that kind of maybe has made a lot of people more curious about if people had only like maybe they'll think of like Jason and Freddy and that's kind of the only thing they think about when it comes to horror. But now there's like, if you like psychological horror, there's a lot to explore. And so I think maybe it's legitimized itself in some people's minds.
Yeah, A24 does a great job of straddling that lowbrow, highbrow
Yeah.
space. I mean, I think mostly highbrow, but I think it makes sort of an artful experience very accessible. And yeah, I think again, this goes back to the movies thing, kind of breaking that barrier and, you know, making it, as Andy said, sort of acceptable or okay, or, you know, it's in the way that like 50 Shades of Grey opened the door for that sort of book. It suddenly became permissible to have that book on the subway
Instead of in a brown paper wrapper. So kind of tailing from that into the next thing, are there some tropes that you're seeing that are coming into their own, and the opposite of that, some tropes that should maybe be dropped because they've gotten a little tired or reworked? Are there some things that you are enjoying seeing more of and some things that you guys think maybe we could see a little less of that?
I mean, I think going back to someone like Jordan Peele, who's ushered in this whole sort of renaissance of like social issues horror, but like horror has always dealt with social issues, but I think in ways that were more oblique. And now it's like people, and it's cool because people can be like, this is my experience and I'm seeing it reflected back in a way that it wasn't like maybe in the 70s, it was like people were coming back from Vietnam and it was really fucked up. And so there were horror, but it wasn't like about people coming back from Vietnam. But I think now there's things that sort of serve that need of people to really engage with something head on. And I think that's kind of new for horror. Instead of it just being this sort of like scary, floaty vibe, there's like social issue horror that's actually about the issues and isn't like hiding behind something else or masking something with, you know, a demon or whatever.
Yeah, but like in terms of things that should go away, I mean, so my book
Tell me about it, Anne.
it's sort of like in this motherhood category, which, and for me personally, it was about not necessarily wanting to have children, it's about the cult of motherhood. But I do think there have been so many books about like so many horror motherhood books now. It's feeling really tired. It seems like every time I see something come around, I'm like, oh, that's in my, it's like we're all going through the same stuff at the same time. There's like all these like elder millennials who are writing horror novels who are all going through the exact same experience and capturing it at the exact same time. And if you're just a little too slow, there's 10 other books about it out there. So, I mean, even now, like the idea of aging, which does play a role in the book I'm currently writing, but I've started to see that everywhere too. I think because everyone was just staring at their faces on Zoom and noticing wrinkles. And so that's how that is happening.
You see a lot of these in the submission pile and you're like, yeah, that's a trend.
Huh.
Do you guys think that given the impetus that horror is currently enjoying and the kind of trips that we're seeing and the trips that are passing into not necessarily oblivion, but more like stasis for a period of time, I'm sure. Do you think that horror has a sustainable future at this point? Like, do you see it, becoming like science fiction never goes away, fantasy never goes away, horror has always seemed to kind of waver in and out and go by different names. You guys, so do you see horror as being a staying power in genre?
I do personally, but I mean, there's like the publishing definition of what horror is, and there's kind of like how I feel about horror, which is that it's like this atmospheric thing that can kind of float down like a cloud and cover a sci-fi novel. Like you could, you get Event Horizon or like, and so I feel like it's sustainably, I feel like it's sustainable forever because of that, because it can always sort of like, even if like straight up horror books kind of experience a decline, like there are plenty of like literary writers that will have horror elements or something like that. So it always kind of like, it might sort of recede, it might kind of pop back out, but it's never going to go away. And I think it's so versatile for that reason. And I think especially now that more people are kind of playing around in its sandbox or whatever, that bodes well for the future of it.
Yeah, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think, similar again to that 50 Shades of Grey comp, it's there now. Like once you break down that barrier, I think it's just going to stay and get bigger and continue to expand. I can't remember what I was going to say.
That's okay. No, what you said was very interesting because I mean, there are a number of ways that genre does that. Like genre is this sort of weird recombinant DNA where you can have science fiction and horror and it's both. You can have fantasy and horror and it's both. You can have a mystery that's both horror and science fiction. It can be all three of those things. And it seems like we can be able to mix and match these things and that authors are doing that more and more with a greater level of skill and facility.
Yeah. I just remembered what I was going to say and it was very much aligned with that.
And it was that.
It's good. But there's still a lot of horror that I hesitate to use the word fringe, but there's a lot of horror that is being published by smaller publishers that is very, I would say, I guess, more violent or a little more experimental that I would love to see get more attention. And I think and hope will. And it, because it is, there's kind of commercial horror. And then there's this other really cool, interesting horror that's happening that isn't quite as publicly, I don't know. Kristen, you're nodding.
What, like
Kristen, would you look right now?
Like Brain Jar or Raw Dog Screaming Press
actually,
or something?
Who am I thinking? Like Haley Piper, right?
Okay.
Haley Piper, Eric LaRocca.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to play?
No. Like stomach turning, really, like I definitely wouldn't have, I would have been like sent away forever if I'd read this as a child, but really interesting and creative stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really great point that I didn't even think of, Atisa. But like horror seems to be in its own little realm of like, there's like a fertile indie horror scene, and a lot of genres don't have that really. So it's cool.
So it's like publishing opened up to horror to an extent, but there's
Yeah.
still some more opening
Yeah,
to do.
it's also one of the
So
last
is it.
bastions of like short stories in a lot of ways. Like horror stories are like, how people cut their teeth. I think in a lot of ways. I didn't, but.
I agree. I think that horror has a facility in short form that's not unlike science fiction, which is where science fiction started, was in
Yeah,
short form. And that there are things that you can do that you can't do otherwise that smack you harder with the literary 2x4.
Like
so
the
to
Carmen
speak.
Mikado book. Which one
Yeah.
was that? Her body, not the parties. That's excellent.
Okay. Now we're going to do the lightning round. And I know you guys are all wondering, what is the lightning round? And that is where I put our authors on the spot. So I thought it would be very interesting to have a series of final questions and then our lightning round. So first off, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to people who are new to the genre or who are perhaps peeking at it through their fingers and thinking it's not for them?
Do you mean readers or people who want to write?
Readers.
You mean readers?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a good question. I would say, honestly, maybe start with the short stories because you could spend a little chunks of time, and if you get scared, you can just kind of put it down. And there's no there's no sort of pressure to finish the novel. Then you can, and I mean, even like Stephen King's Night Shift, like an early book of his, like there is scary stuff in there, but like it's broken up by like sort of like darkly funny stuff and like some sci-fi horror and things like that. Like it's really freewheeling. So that might be a good way to kind of dip your toe in, actually.
And also maybe classic horror, like
Yeah.
is it like We All Lived in the Castle?
Yeah.
That
Shirley
one, and then
Jackson's a
like
good way to
I think it's
start.
called Children on the Hill. Children of the. I'm really bad at recalling details. By the way, Children of the Hill, Children on the Hill, a gothic style story.
Yeah, for sure.
That one's not classic. That's more recent, but it's sort of in that style. But I think classics would be a great place to start. Honestly, like even just Dracula or something like that to sort of.
I had no
That's
idea
cool.
that. I mean, like I suspected they did that, but like that's no, they're not fake. They're real. It's really cool. We have our own hydroponics here at Macmillan, just in case of zombie apocalypse.
Yeah. It's like a
We're always prepared.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to ask you for titles because it's always nice to give the audience some things to look up that they might be interested in at the end. So audience, if you want to take out your phones to like take notes, we'll give you a second to like pull those out. So we're going to do recommendations now,
Sure.
one title.
Okay.
So book recommendation for people who know nothing, total neophytes. Andy.
Can I recommend the short story collection I just recommended?
Yes.
Night Shift by Stephen King.
Anne?
I'm gonna go with American Rapture, which I'm reading now. Just came out.
Okay. Are there books that you would recommend for the horror curious?
How about A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay? It's like a reality show ghost story. It's really cool and it's eerie and it's scary, but it's not gonna like, you're not gonna be like, oh God, after the first page. It's a slow burn. You'll like it. You'll like it.
So get it.
Yeah.
I think mine would again be that Children. I think it's On the Hill. I'm sorry, guys. I'll look it up later. But it's Children of the Hill or Children on the Hill.
Okay. Brady cats.
Oh, like total beginners? Like,
No, like people who are like, no, I don't want anything squeaky.
is this less than the neophyte or better? I don't know where this falls.
Like people who are complete candy asses.
Okay.
I said it.
People like me who said cozy horror, which makes
Like cozy horror.
Oh.
Yeah, it doesn't make any
Cozy-
sense. But
no,
it's like,
it does
yeah,
make sense. Yeah, cozy horror.
right, exactly. Something horrible, but they can sleep.
How about, well, this might be scary, but there's a book called Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. That's cozy. It's kind of like cozy horror. It's like a farm horror. This might be scary.
It's
I don't
farm
know.
horror. There are scythes.
Yeah, there's scythes. There's like brothers that do weird stuff.
You're selling it, Andy.
Yeah, I'm not selling it at all. There's got to be a cozy horror that I'm not thinking of. Who writes like nice ghost stories? Yeah, I don't know.
I'm editing. I mean, it's middle grade, so if you're into that. But if you liked Are You Afraid of the Dark, I have some middle grade books partnered with Paramount, with Nickelodeon, and they specifically don't allow dead bodies on the page, so people
Okay.
just kind of disappear.
I don't see how that's less disturbing, but okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Do you have a YA recommendation?
I don't personally. It's not something I know anything about YA
Okay.
horror, but maybe
And?
Anne does.
I honestly, I haven't read YA in a while, but Tiffany Jackson has a great reputation for YA horror. So
Okay, awesome. And then finally, for someone who is absolutely hardcore and can take it,
Oh,
like hardcore, like metalhead horror.
oh man. Maybe Pet Cemetery. That's pretty brutal.
that's probably where your Eric LaRocca
Yeah,
type of book comes
that's
in.
that.
All right,
Yeah,
that's cool.
that's that.
And is there anything, before we leave people to have conversations and talk about all the things that we chatted about, is there anything that you would like to kind of say to wrap things up that you didn't get the opportunity to express?
I will. Can I go back and recommend one other book?
Absolutely.
I don't know. I think this is mid-range, but Stephen Graham Jones wrote a book called Mongrels, And it was one of my, when I was first starting to write horror, it was one of my favorites. It's a werewolf story, but not how you think. It's sort of like a family on the margins who are also these werewolves that need to feed. And it's very like this episodic kind of like gritty story. And it's not like you could read it. It's not like scary. It's just really good. So I recommend that. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that
Do
brought
not
to mind,
apologize.
aside from the CJ lead books, I recommended American Rapture and Mayfly. I loved Tender is the Flesh and only read that recently. And it's an Argentinian writer and it's just incredibly beautiful. And well, that's a weird thing to say about horror, but it is. It's, I guess, more literary horror, but really, really haunting and very worthwhile.
Yeah.
Tender is the Flesh.
Does anybody need anybody to repeat anything so that you can type faster with your thumbs? Okay, awesome.
I talk really fast, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, this is the point in time where we open up to questions from the audience, like a reality show. And I'm going to come over here. My back is a little out, so I'm moving slowly.
Hello, I'm Kelsey. Big horror fan. And one thing that always interests me is I love when it gets really gross, really in the nitty gritty, like show me the terrifying stuff. But I also think something that's really powerful is when you don't show it and you let people's imaginations create the scariest thing for them. Where do you guys fall on that spectrum versus like really, really showing the gross stuff versus letting people imagine the scary stuff?
Andy's grosser than I am.
Yeah.
A lot grosser.
Not a lot.
You are. I don't know. That's interesting. I'm probably more restrained, but every now and then, I just really like creating suspense and tension, psychological scenarios. So probably I'm closer to that, but I think we both like delving into some gross stuff.
Yeah, my new book, The Swarm, is about a cicada apocalypse, and there's really gross like hybridization stuff and things like that I really just love writing. So I love like I love the nitty gritty of the grotesquerie, and I like people being able to vividly kind of live in that. But I also I love cosmic horror too, so I like there being like this off-screen thing that's just like mind-blowingly insane. But I also think that that's become a trope of itself. And it's a bit of a cop-out now, so I try not to ever really lean on it too hard, where it's like, trust me, there's a thing, if you look at it, you'll go insane, but I don't know what it is. So I really try hard to avoid that, although I like it being tinged with that kind of stuff. So it's both the things you said, again, it's like that wire walk. It's just, you gotta, it's a push-pull, and I think the best horror does both.
I know exactly what you mean, though. I love restrained writing in any genre. And I feel like I try to do it. It's really hard to do. And I don't know, I try to do it, but don't always succeed. But that's the kind of thing I like to read too.
Yeah.
I'm going to go over this and we're going to come back.
I know Andy mentioned Stephen King a couple of times, and I read somewhere someone was interviewing him or told him a number of his books had been banned in Florida, and he was like really shocked. So I was wondering if this is really for all three of you. Have you ever run into that in the horror genre? And is it anything you even think about that, books could be banned for some reason?
It's inevitable and I don't care. If it's good, I'm going to put it out there. I don't care if somebody finds it offensive. Other people are going to want to read it. Just because it's not for you doesn't mean it's not for somebody else. And so, and even if it's something that's not for me, I often will go to another editor and say, hey, this is really good, but it's not my kind of book. I'm not the reader. Ugh. And they'll get the book. So yeah, I don't care. What do you guys?
Yeah, it doesn't bother me if I received an email recently that was like, how an interview for whatever, blah, blah, your book was banned. But they thought it was YA, and I was like, of course it would be banned. Not that I support, I definitely do not support banning of books in any circumstance, but yeah. And I was like, well, it's not like really that appropriate for teenagers. I don't know. But in any case, I don't care.
I'm like, maybe parent.
Yeah, it doesn't ever, if I'm writing something, I never think about how this will play in, a situation like that or anything. I just have other concerns, and I write what I write, and
I think about whether my parents will ban me.
Yeah. You do have to think about your parents. That's the only thing.
What if
haven't,
my
but they
mom
might
picked
soon.
this up? Okay, now I'm gonna come over here, give this side of the room some love.
Hey guys,
Hi, Victoria.
glad we made it up here.
Yeah, yeah.
So I remember as a kid reading Stephen King's It and leaving it in my car because I was so scared of it.
Yeah.
And then when I did bring it inside, I would put it in the freezer because it scared me too. And I would never let it in my bedroom. So has there any book in your life scared you that much?
We were just talking yesterday about scary stories to tell in the dark, because that's the first book that ever scared me. And I was like, I read it when I was like 6 or 7. And I remember reading it in broad daylight and being really freaked out. And I don't know how I got away with having that. But
Yeah.
that was the first book that ever really made me like look, behind me. And
Yeah, there's the spider lady with the face and everything. But and yeah, and kids would like tell those stories on the playground. It would like kids would like memorize them and everything. And that was definitely for me, like I would be like, I don't even want to look at this illustration. This is so creepy and stuff like that. But honestly, those feelings, I mean, I lost the magic of Christmas too. And like those feelings as I got older, like I love horror, but it's definitely become more academic for me than like an emotional thing where I'm like, oh my God, I can't turn this page anymore. Like I can, and I do, and I'll read whatever. And it's like, it's kind of a bummer, but I still, it's just a different way of enjoying something. Like
we're like always chasing that thrill with movies too.
yeah, it's like, it's hard to kind of get that back when you start exploring more and more extreme things too. And then it's like, you get desensitized and yeah.
Curious about the freezer choice as your
Yeah,
safe
that's
space.
great.
I'm actually kind of curious about that too. Wouldn't that be a good trope? When you're afraid of
Yeah.
something, it goes in the freezer and then it goes bad.
Did the pages get like brittle and icy? Like, could you? Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's funny.
Wow, I have so many
Is there a
questions.
lock on your freezer?
Yeah.
More questions. More questions over here on this side of the room. You have one? That's right. Aaron has one. I will get to you, making me walk all around, get my steps in for the day.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rowan. Thank you both so much for coming down. This is wonderful. I'm curious what, for both of your greatest either personal discovery or sort of like human nature discovery working within this genre specifically versus biographical research or fiction or nonfiction. If along your time with horror, you run into anything when it comes to human nature or your own personal experience with humanity that you're like, oh wow, like whilst writing this, I really discovered something. And if not too, that's totally okay.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Anne would agree that I really can bring something to like exploring the psychology of characters, but I often like can't carry that emotionality over to my real life. You know what I mean?
I think you're great emotionally.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I feel like I walked into something here.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
No, that's an interesting point, because I do think on the page you really grapple very intimately with your characters, and maybe it's a little harder for you to like confront emotionality,
That's
as
what I
I think
meant.
for
Yeah.
many people,
Yeah.
like in a conversation with the two of us, but you've gotten much better.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but that's not just you.
No, that's true.
I'm just a weirdly emotional person. So for me, I mean, I think about my writing process. In writing my next book, it's been more difficult than I could have imagined. And I had to sort of face that I do all these weird things that I guess as an editor, I thought maybe I had sort of overcome. But I've had a really major psychological block. It's felt very difficult to write the next one. And I think it's sort of an imposter syndrome type of thing, like not seeing my first book succeed as much as I wanted it to, and then wondering if I'm good enough and things like that. And then it sort of leading to a ton of second guessing and thinking just, why do I have a right to do this? And sort of that sort of thing.
And that's where I step in because I'm Anne's new editor. So we're going to be working on this. But this is, I feel like I can kind of step in here. That's part of an editorial job. Like your job is to step in and see where the gaps are, see where things are working, things that aren't working, and to take those elements where you can tell that there's an insecurity. And so there's this framework for it and saying, no, trust yourself, trust what you're writing, and pull the framework out and see what happens. So it's for us, it's a kind of tap dance and, walking on a wire between, you need to be encouraging. At the same time, you need to be very real, because sugarcoating stuff is not going to help you. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about horror is people trusting weirdly their own darker instincts. And I often find myself, no, darker, and saying like, I want a higher body count. and my authors are like, you want more bodies? There's only 6. We need 8.
You have an actual number that you want to see.
Yeah, it's like, no, I want more. And kind of pushing the envelope, because sometimes they get hung up on, can I go that far? The answer is, yeah, you kind of can.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, for me personally, I think it's part of what I was speaking about earlier, like being raised a certain way and like, this is how you're supposed to be, and this is how you're supposed to present. And then like putting on a paper for the entire world to see that like, this is actually what happens in your brain is a little frightening. And I've always just felt much more confident helping guide other people than being on the other side of it.
I just like bringing out darker instincts. Like, it's a thing.
We're going to be great together.
We're going to be awesome.
Yeah,
It's going to be lovely.
you'd be pretty surprised how dark.
It's going to be awesome. I'm going to make you really dark. Yes, there's another question over here.
So I guess, sorry, there must be something wrong with me, because I don't think I've ever read anything that actually truly scares me, I guess, to the point where like,
There we go.
I think for me, I think some of the things I see in humanity probably scares me more than actual horror.
Yeah.
So on that point, is there anything like, not that maybe that you've experienced or is there something that you've seen that you've ever maybe used in some of your stories? Whether it might be a real serial killer or, something like that, something not necessarily using the gift, but just something that spurs you to write something.
I mean, there's definitely glimpses of things from my life that I use as inspiration for my work. Even if it's just like a certain facial expression or like a moment that I felt chilled, I'm always like taking notes and trying to bring it in some way into my work. Because I think if you're not afraid of the thing you're writing, it's unlikely your reader will be. I mean, I hear you on, it's very difficult to be, and you said the same thing, like truly scared. But we all have moments in life when we felt afraid, whether it's afraid of betrayal or, failure, any of those things. So if you can think of just one moment in time when you felt that way and what was specific about that, trying to bring in that kind of specificity for me. What about you?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've definitely had moments where I've like taken real life, a headline will catch my attention or something like that, and I'll think of something or I'll see something really horrific. And like a good example is this never ended up going anywhere because like all writers, I have a million unpublished things, drafts and stuff like that. But I read an article about like the horrifying job of like social media content moderation and like people having really horrible like lifelong problems because their jobs are to sit there and they have to search out and delete like hundreds of beheading videos or something like that, and the toll that takes on you. And I started to think how horrific that was, and that kind of inspired, I guess.
He sent me that, and I swear to God, I felt like to throw up. It was so stomach turning, and I was like, "Are you like?"
Yeah.
And we were just dating. Then I was like, "Oh."
Yeah. Yeah, that was so. Yes, if I see something like you, really, really horrific, obviously my mind starts spinning about it. But yeah, it's that stuff definitely is like more scary and stomach churning than anything I could make up. Like, yeah.
Also, if you ever have nightmares, I mean, I have a ton of nightmares. You sometimes have nightmares, but like sometimes I do use some of that imagery, as silly as it sounds. But if you can really mine some of that stuff in an interesting way.
Hi, my name is Catherine, And it's kind of similar or related to that question because Stephen King has been mentioned a lot. In his book on writing, he talks about the importance of reading outside of the genre that you're writing in. And so has there been any book, short story, literature outside of the horror genre? And outside, I would say, from like sci-fi and fantasy, because it's closely related, that you found deeply influenced your horror writing?
Yeah, I also write historical novels for middle grade readers, and the series started with Escape from Chernobyl, and it's become like a historical catastrophe focused series. There's like Escape from East Berlin, Escape from Stalingrad, and so I end up reading a lot about like these big 20th century, these like mind-blowingly catastrophic things, like 2 million people dying in Stalingrad, and it's like you can't even comprehend it. But it's like, this is a book for kids I'm writing, but like. And so, yeah, I've kind of become a big history buff because of this, and that really informs my work. And I would say most of the reading I do is outside the horror genre, partly out of necessity for research, and just partly because I think it's important to cultivate broad interests. Like, I think only reading horror gives you a really narrow, and then you're taking this from that and this from that. But it's like, if you're reading so broadly, then it's, at least for me, that helps me have a more like fertile imagination, I guess.
Yeah, I think similarly, definitely nonfiction rooted in historical happenings. I find very inspiring. I've been reading a lot of nonfiction and bits and pieces for my new book. But I read a book, which of course I can't remember the title, but this was like 15 years ago. It's by Rohinton Mystery. What is that? Do you remember that book? I gave it to like 4 people and I can't remember what it's called.
I remember it, but
it was nominated for a Booker. It takes place in India. It focused a lot on just like various atrocities happening in India. And at the time I happened to be living in India, and I don't know, it felt like very true and very, it just moved me a lot emotionally. And that was something that definitely made a big impression, thinking more about just sort of the individual human experience and, that sort of thing, and how can, I don't know, just how it can move people.
Yeah. Me either.
I am now recalling the thing that moved me into horror. Several years ago, I read a nonfiction book called The Knife Man, which was about, God, I can't even remember his name. He was one of the first surgeons in Britain. He was the model for Jekyll and Hyde. And he was an absolute nutcase. And it was fascinating. So yeah, The Knife Man, highly recommended. It's pretty wild. You're like, this happened? Really? Yeah, and you get those little tidbits of history from that, like the Resurrection Men, also bonkers. Yeah, and I can see how reading widely, especially in like catastrophe type stuff, can be very influencing, at the same time really allow your imagination to spin off in different directions.
Also, the mental illness category. I mean, like, I don't know, we watch a lot of documentaries too, and there was one about 6 brothers in the same family who all had schizophrenia. And I find that my dad was a psychologist, so I've always found all this fascinating. Just like what causes various, I don't know, various chemical imbalances, or just, I don't know.
I think it boils down to an interest in the human psyche,
Yeah.
and human behavioral attitudes. Like that is where, I mean, that's what horror is. It is it's a deep dive into the human psyche, and it's messed up.
Yeah, and Anne is more interested in the human psyche than pretty much anyone I've ever met too. So I think it really helps.
We are
inform her
so
work
going to
and
get
stuff.
along
Yeah.
so well.
She's always like, do you know that podcast, The Hidden Brain? Yeah. She's really into The Hidden Brain. And when we're in the car, I'm like, oh man, we have to listen to The Hidden Brain. It's good though. Yeah.
It actually helps you better at work. It's a really good podcast.
Yeah. No, it is.
It's an awesome podcast. What's wrong with you?
Oh man.
Well, I think we are winding down our evening. We don't have any further questions. And the people who put this together are gesturing at one another. Mysteriously, I'm not really sure what this means or doesn't mean. Here, have a mic.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a cold, so I had Peggy read my intro on Irene. I do programming here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Jen, Anne, and Andy. This was super informative, really entertaining. Great recommendations. Thank you for giving that to us here. We are a nonprofit. If you liked this event, please consider becoming a member if you aren't one already, because we do things like this all year round. And it's only $25 a year. Our next event is on November 20th on the craft of print, how digital printing is changing the landscape of print. And then we have our holiday party on December 11th, which will be really fun, maybe a little bit spooky, taking some recommendations for, well, I don't know. Yeah, we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we're gonna bring Krampus in there. So thank you, everyone. Yeah, Rich. Oh yes, November will be a virtual. Thank you, Rich. November will be a virtual event, so it won't be in person. But please do join us online. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Hope to see you again next
Thank you
time.
for
Thank
having
you
us.
to our panelists.